Before we explore laws governing mortgage lending, we should talk about mortgage fraud. When someone purposely makes a statement they know is incorrect or inaccurate with the intent to deceive another party, they have committed fraud. Due to the significant amount of money that's transferred in the real estate market, fraud is especially important to watch out for. There are 5 conditions that generally mark a statement as fraudulent. First, fraudulent statements always relate to some kind of material fact. On top of this, a fraudulent statement must have a significant effect on a person's decision on a course of action. With real estate, a statement is required to have bearing on the relevant transaction to be considered fraudulent. Second, the person who makes the fraudulent statement must be aware that the statement is incorrect or inaccurate. Providing misinformation or misrepresenting something out of ignorance is usually seen as a form of negligence, but it's not necessarily a form of fraud. Intent is usually what determines whether an act is just negligence or rises to the level of fraud. Third, the purpose of a fraudulent statement is to cause harm to someone or to deprive someone of some right. Fourth, the target of the fraud must have reasonably relied on the fraudulent statement or statements. The important thing to keep in mind is that fraud involves knowingly and purposely taking advantage of a person who cannot possibly have known about the deception. Fifth, normally, someone must suffer harm for something to be considered fraud. However, it's important to note that there are situations in which the attempt to defraud a person is enough to subject the perpetrator to punishment under the law. An incorrect or inaccurate statement will more often be considered fraud if it can be determined that the party that made the false statement had superior knowledge to the party who acted on the false information and was harmed as a result. In addition to providing false information, fraud can also result from failing to provide information. If a lack of information fulfills the categories mentioned earlier, it can be considered fraud. Mortgage fraud is a criminal act that involves the willful misrepresentation or omission of information during the mortgage lending process, with the intent to cause financial harm to another party. While most mortgage fraud affects lenders, borrowers can also be harmed by mortgage fraud. The FBI investigates allegations of mortgage fraud in 2 broad categories. The first is fraud for profit. This primarily involves financial industry professionals such as bank officers, appraisers, or mortgage brokers, using their expertise or authority to reap personal gains through commission of fraudulent actions. The second is fraud for housing. This primarily involves borrowers attempting to acquire or maintain ownership of a property through fraud. Mortgage fraud is a felony in Michigan, punishable by imprisonment or fines or both. Michigan laws identifies a number of acts that constitute mortgage fraud. Making a false statement or misrepresentation during the mortgage lending process is considered to be a fraudulent act. So is deliberately concealing material facts or failing to disclose material facts. Just because a false statement, misrepresentation, concealment, or failure to disclose was committed by another person doesn't make it any less fraudulent if you utilize it. When it comes to intent to perform a future event or have an event performed, you cannot make or use a false pretense, even if it came from someone else. Michigan law defines a false pretense to include any false or fraudulent representation, writing, communication, statement, or message. If it's communicated to another person and the person who made it knows it's false or fraudulent. A false pretense can relate to either a past or existing fact or circumstance. It can also relate to a representation about intentions regarding a future event. It's also a fraudulent act in Michigan to receive or attempt to receive money from a mortgage lending process that you know resulted from either false statements or misrepresentations, or a deliberate concealment or failure to disclose material information. Filing mortgage lending documents that you know contain deliberate misstatements, misrepresentations, or omissions with a Michigan County Register of Deeds is also considered a fraudulent act. It's also still fraud if you arrange to have these kinds of documents filed by another person. Failure to disperse funds in accordance with a mortgage loan settlement or closing statement is classified as fraud as well. Finally, conspiring to commit any of the actions we mentioned earlier is itself a fraudulent act. The same goes for soliciting, encouraging, or coercing another person to commit those actions. Now that we have covered this, we'll talk about some of the major laws governing lending, especially mortgage lending.